Let's continue asking some questions, some philosophical questions about being. And one of the very important categories that we talk about with being is cause or causation. What exactly is cause and what is causation? Now remember, with a lot of these, we're going to ask questions without giving a lot of answers. But you have a whole lifetime to go explore these philosophical questions. So cause and causation. This fundamental question arises very early in the study of being, since any explanation of anything seems to involve reference to causes. If we want to know why something is, if we're seeking to explain being, it seems that we must know what a cause is and what kinds of causes there are. This is an enormous issue that breaks into a number of distinct issues. So, for instance, what exactly is the nature of the necessitation, we can call it, or the necessary relationship between cause and effect? That is, just what is it about a cause that makes the effect result? What's the connection between a cause and its effect, and why does it seem necessary? Why is it, in all these instances when we think of cause and effect, that when one thing happens, another thing happens? What's the nature of that relationship? This question was raised particularly by David Hume. That's a name we've heard before, very skeptical philosopher. And his skeptical answer was that we observe no such quote-unquote have-tos, necessity, between causes and effects. All we really see are constant patterns of befores and afters. So he actually denies the reality, the ontological, right? Ontological reality of cause and effect, of causation. He says, look at the world around you. When one billiard ball hits another one, when the cue ball hits the 8-ball, you're accustomed to saying that the cue ball causes the 8-ball to move. But point to cause. You can point to one ball moving, you can point to another ball moving, but you can't point to cause, right? All you see is constant before and after. And he says all causation is your mind getting accustomed to repetitions of befores and afters. Maybe causation doesn't really even exist. So there's the skeptical David Hume for you. Here's another question. Are immediate causes just the latest in an infinite series of caused causes? So you see the billiard ball, the cue ball hit the 8-ball, right? Well, there's a chain that put that in motion. Your cue stick struck the cue ball, and your hand moved the cue stick, and your arm moved your hand, and your elbow moved your arm, and it, the arm bone's connected to that, right? And that goes on, right? And we could trace that chain back. Philosophers like Aristotle believed that such a regress of dependencies was impossible to go back infinitely. But if that's the case, then there must have been an uncaused causation. Well, then what's that? What's the nature of that uncaused cause? We'll look at that a little more when we talk about Aristotle in a bit, and we'll also return to it in part 5 when we talk about God. But this is an interesting thing to think about. I was at the library playing with my son, and they have a magnetic board where you stick up gears. And we made this long chain of gears, and if you turn the first gear with a little knob, the whole system turns, this whole chain of gears. And the only way the last gear in the line will be turning is if someone's turning the first gear. There has to be a first gear, right? And if the first gear ceases, the whole system, including the last one, ceases. Question is the universe of causes like that? Is there a first gear here and now? Not backwards in time, but here and now. Is there a first cause of motion that is itself not caused by another? We'll come back to that. How about this? Is there such a thing as chance? That is a really uncaused cause, which appears or arises from no other source, right? What's the nature of chance? Does it really even exist? Unfortunately, we're going to have to forego this discussion. It's an important question. We just don't have time to get into, especially given some of the developments in quantum physics, which seem to suggest that things can arise apparently uncaused, or at least uncaused in ways that we would think of in common sense terms. How about this? Is there an uncaused cause which does not itself appear or arise from a source but always existed? This actually relates to the 2 bullet points up, right? This is just the other end of the chain, really, right? We asked, is any cause here and now just the latest in a series of causes? And if that's the case, is there a first cause, an uncaused cause? Again, we'll take that up in part 5, because Aristotle, and then Thomas Aquinas following him, will say, yeah, there's an uncaused cause. There has to be, in fact, for any causation to happen here and now. And that uncaused cause, they say, everyone calls God. Here's a difficult one, and again, we're only going to touch on it, unfortunately. What's the nature of the sort of causation referred to as free agency, or that is free will, especially attributed to human beings, right? Are my choices caused? And if so, to what extent and in what way? And if they are caused, how am I free? And if I am completely free and utterly free and they're not caused, then how are they not just random? So there's 3 standard views of the sort of causation that free will is. And admittedly, these are somewhat simplified, and if we had an infinite amount of time, they overlap and there's nuances, but we'll give you the 3 general strands of thought. The first would be libertarianism, and it has nothing to do with the political view of libertarianism. This is the view that humans have a capacity called choice or free will, which allows them to initiate actions that, well, maybe they're motivated by desires, they're not determined by them, right? Libertarianism, that comes from the word for freedom, right? I'm liberty, right? Freedom. I'm not determined by my desires. Thus, it's possible, here's the litmus test for a libertarian in this sense. It's possible that given exactly the same physical, motivational, and external circumstances, I, facing a choice of marrying Mary Beth or not, could have chosen to marry her or not to marry her, right? So given the complete explanatory system around the same circumstances, right down to the subatomic particles in our brains and our backgrounds and the weather that day, given the complete set of circumstances, I could either choose X or not X. I'm not determined. Thus, according to the libertarian view, free will is a kind of uncaused causation. I can do this or that, independent of all of those exterior and even interior factors. The problem with this view is if motives nudge me in favor of a particular choice but don't determine that choice, well, then what does? What does determine my choice? If nothing does, then it looks like choice is ultimately chance. It's just a random event. An event which comes down to no source and therefore has no explanation. But that doesn't seem right. But in that case, how can I be held responsible for my choices, whatever it was? Right? If they're just completely random, how am I blameworthy or praiseworthy for anything I do? If something does determine my choice, then, well, then determinism seems true, and that's number 2, determinism. Determinism is the view that humans and their behavior, like all other beings in the world, are entirely subject to the physical laws of the world, right? So your choices are based on your brain states, and your brain states are nothing more than chemicals and subatomic particles bouncing around due to very determined physical laws. And so you get a certain input, a certain set of very complex inputs, and that very complex thing that we call your brain will give a very definite outcome, right? So they are determined. As a result, your behaviors and your so-called choices that prompted them are entirely determined by those laws. So according to determinism, free will is a form of entirely caused causation, right? Libertarianism said it's completely uncaused causation. This says it's completely caused causation. This goes very well with the metaphysics of materialism, that you're just nothing more than matter, than stuff, than physical stuff, right? You're just ultimately a brain. The problem with this view is actually the same as the one above. If the ultimate cause of my behavior are factors and events and laws that I have no control over, then how can I be held responsible for my behavior? We don't praise or blame the 8-ball when it reacts in a very predictable geometric way when it's hit by the cue ball. It's neither praiseworthy nor blameworthy. But we seem to praise and blame people based on their actions. And if they're nothing more than complex bouncing around of billiard balls, then why would we praise or blame them? So that brings us to a third view, compatibilism. Compatibilism is the view that what human freedom means is being able, unimpeded, to act on your desires. Now think about that. This says that freedom, what it means, it's kind of a redefinition of freedom. It's being able, unimpeded, to act on your desires. Humans, at least sometimes, are able to act on their desires. Therefore, humans are free, right? They're not bound. They're not restricted from acting on their desires. That's compatible. It's an element of compatibilism. But because human desires are entirely determined by the physical laws of the world, including the desire that rises to the level of the strongest desire, then determinism is still true. So free will is, after all, compatible with determinism, hence the compatibilism. This is saying, yeah, there's a determinism, but freedom is just the unhindered ability to act in accord with those determined desires. Problem with this view. Freedom, as compatibilism defines it, being able to act unimpeded on one's desires, is a capacity shared with us by many animals, right? My cat is generally unimpeded from acting according to its desires. And surely we would not hold them morally responsible for their actions. And with good reason. For if their desires are entirely determined, then we can trace the causes of their actions back to the nature, nurture, and environmental stimuli causes of those desires. But then, it's difficult to see how the acting individual, human, can be held responsible for those actions. So we come back to the same problem. I think most people instinctively, if you were to give these three views without going into all the problems, most people are going to lean towards libertarianism, that free will exists. I'm really free to do this or that, and there may be motivations, and sometimes my freedom certainly can be hindered or lessened, right? But for the most part, yeah, we have free will. Small tangent here off of the notes. It gets a lot more complicated now once you add in God's providence. God is provident over everything. God is guiding all of creation to its end. Now we're getting into some theology, right? We have to add in some of what God has revealed. God is intimately involved with his creation. Not only does he create us in every aspect of being, but he holds it in being now. He even holds in being cause and effect right now. And so some of our best theology would say you can't choose to do X or Y unless God moves you to do X and Y, and he moves you to do so freely. So I actually just finished this last semester a course on providence and predestination. And you get into the weeds here. But there's a form of compatibilism that says God moves the human person to their actions, and he does so such that they will them freely. So that we are really, it's compatible that both God moves us and that we freely move. Now, if that was confusing, it was even more confusing after a semester of teaching it. So the point perhaps is that these discussions get very tangled, and they get even more tangled once you bring in God's overarching providence over all things. We can perhaps talk about that in class if you're interested. Okay, so that's free will. Let's talk about questions about the one and the many. This is some language that goes back to ancient philosophy, the idea of the one and the many. So let's ask some questions. First of all, is there more than one being? And you go, well, yes, of course there is. You look around, there's a cat and there's a dog, more than one being, and I'm neither of them. There's three beings, right? So of course, the common sense answer here is yes, there are many beings, as is evident from experience. This is what we call the particularist version of metaphysical pluralism, right? Metaphysical pluralism. There are many, there's more than one kind of being. There have been philosophers who say no, there is in fact only one being. This is a very non-commonsensical view, but you find philosophers who hold all kinds of non-commonsensical views. Philosophers of this kind would say that all the multiplicity evident in the experience that we have really reveals different aspects or properties or attributes or manifestations or appearances of this one single reality. Or the multiplicity is simply an illusion, and true understanding of being consists in dispelling this illusion and realizing that everything is just one. Now, note this, answering this question requires answering the prior question of what it means for anything to be one being. That is, what's the nature of the unity that defines what it means to be a being? Right now, commonsensically, you know what a being is. There's a chair. There's a cat. That's a being. But if you start thinking about it, it gets a little more complicated. So surely a cat is a being in a way that a coal pile is not, right? There's individual pieces of coal, right? How do we describe the characteristic unity of a being, right? Those are two different kinds of beings. You know, the cat has a unity, right? It's one thing that a pile of coal doesn't. It's a different kind of unity. But then you go even deeper and say, well, is the cat's tail a being? Right? And then you start thinking about when we start getting down to lower levels or subatomic particles. If you look at a chair, you say, well, yeah, a chair is a being. But what about an atom? Isn't an atom a being? And isn't a chair just made up of atoms? So is a chair a being, or is it millions and millions and billions of little beings called atoms? What constitutes the unity of a thing? And for that matter, I don't know if I get into this later. I think I do in Change. Maybe I should wait for that. But skipping ahead maybe, what about the question of change of a being? A thing is itself. It has a unity. But what about change? How can a thing change but remain itself? So there's a classical example of a ship. A ship comes into dock, a ship made of wood, and certain pieces need repair. I believe it's, if I'm not mistaken, it's called the Ship of Theseus, but don't quote me on that. So the ship comes in and they have to replace a plank. So out goes one board and in comes another board. And we go, is that the same ship? Well, most of us will go, yeah, that's the same ship. Well, we need to replace 5 boards. So they replaced 5 boards. Is that the same ship? Well, yeah, it's a big ship, 5 boards. What if we have to replace 100 boards all over the ship? Well, you start to ask, well, how big is this ship? How many boards are we talking in the first place? What if over time, what if over 10 years, slowly one board is replaced at a time, right? The first time a board is replaced, you say it's the same ship. What about next week when it comes in and they replace another one? Well, it's the same ship. But what if over time every board has been replaced? And then all of a sudden you have a ship made of completely different stuff than the one you started with. Is that the same ship? And if you answer no, be careful, because think of the material that makes up your body. It's completely different than it was 10 years ago, I think. Certainly than when you were an infant. Are you the same person? Right? If you remember Star Trek, when people would beam from one place to another, all right, they take them apart and reassemble them. Are they the same person? Right? There's actually books written about this, the philosophy of Star Trek. So, okay, a little tangent there. So, is there more than one kind of being, and what counts for change in being? I think we come back to change in a little bit. Well, how about this? If there's more than one being, is there more than one kind of being? Right? Many would answer, of course, yes. For example, there are material beings and immaterial beings, like minds or angels. This is a kind of version of metaphysical pluralism. There's more than one kind of being. Note that prior to answering this question, one must answer the question of how being can be divided up into different kinds of being. Well, what do we mean by kind of being? That is, what is it that separates being into different kinds? Right? Is a cat really of a different kind of being than a dog? Well, who knows, right? But it certainly seems that if angels are real, I'm a different kind of being than an angel. Now, some people would say, no, there are not different kinds of being. And if not, right, if there exists only one kind of being, we would call this metaphysical monism, only one kind of being. If not, there are two different kind of flavors of this metaphysical monism. If there's only one kind of being, maybe you're a materialist. Materialism, that is aka physicalism, sometimes also called naturalism, says that all being is physical. It's all just matter and energy. This is a widely held view in both ancient and modern times. Plenty of materialists or physicalists out there today. And then there's idealism. You don't find a lot of idealists running around except in philosophy departments. This group would say all being is spiritual or non-physical. Right? This view seems very contrary to our usual experience of the world around us. However, it's been embraced by a surprising number of philosophers, most notably names we've heard like Berkeley and Leibniz. Idealism. Most people you run into actually believe the world around you, the physical world, exists, though. How about this one? Assuming that there are more than one kind of being, how? How can there be many different kinds or essences of beings, right? Father W. Norris Clarke has a book called The One and the Many, a contemporary Thomistic metaphysics. We'll talk about Thomism in a little bit, but Father Clarke articulates what he takes to be the Thomistic solution to this question following St. Thomas Aquinas. What does it mean to say that there are different kinds or essences of being? Well, what is the difference in being between an angel and me and an apple and an antelope, right? If there is an analogy of being, what accounts for different kinds of beings? So essentially, Father Clarke says that what differentiates one kind of being from another is the degree to which it shares in the act, A-C-T, that is the power of the inherently unlimited act of existence. That is, there's existence itself, just the sheer act of being is unlimited. It has no bounds, right? Different things share to a different degree in that one unlimited act of being, and we're limited by our essences. So as a human, my human nature limits my act of existence in a way different than a frog's essence limits its act of existence. All right, so for example, a human enjoys more of the act of existence than a frog, which enjoys more of the act of existence than a mosquito, which enjoys more of the act of existence than a hydrogen atom. So thus an essence or a nature such as humanness or frogness or the nature of hydrogen is just one specific set of limits on an otherwise unlimited act of existence. So you can think of it as a container. Your humanness is a container into which the act of existence is poured, right? And a fly's flyness is just, its essence is just the container into which the unlimited act of existence is poured. And the fly's container limits that act of existence much more than your container, humanness, limits the act of existence for you. Now, of course, you can extrapolate this out and go, what about something that doesn't have a limitation? What if it isn't a container? What if it's just the sheer act of existence itself? Unlimited existence. And that we would call God. How about this? Assuming that there are not only more than one kind of being, but also more than one individual belonging to each kind, how can there be many particulars which are yet one in kind? How is it that there is a certain thing as humanness, right? The nature of humanness, but you're a human and I'm a human and your classmates are human? We've looked at this before, right? We've looked at this question in part 1, the idea of abstract ideas, what they represent, or universals, we've called them, right? Several answers to this question. Nominalism, remember this? Nominalism says we should not be confused by our language of humanness or flyness, and its talk of kinds as though they were, for example, a reality like humankind or humanness, which is distinct from all human individuals. Rather, for a nominalist, there are only individual beings. Only the individual exists, which are or are not similar in various ways. So there are no universals for the nominalists. Those are just names that name similar individuals. And this similarity is a sort of brute fact about those things, not something to be explained by postulating a kind of a kind or an essence or a common property or anything like that, which is a funny kind of reality that can exist in many places at the same time. On the other hand, you have the realists. This is Aristotle or Thomas Aquinas. There is, they say, an odd sort of reality. Not a full being by itself, but a reality nonetheless. A reality nonetheless, which does exist in many places at the same time. Namely, something like an essence or kind or nature or common properties. Aristotle called this form. That would be, this would mean that I have the same form as you do. Our forms are the same kind of thing. Actually, in our case, it would be our souls. You have a human soul, I have a human soul. We both have the same form. It's a human soul. But a table in one room and a different table in another room would have the same form, right? Essence, kind, nature. These forms, they're possible ways of existing, possible ways of being. For example, the form humanness. That form combines with another kind of potentiality, a particular spatio-temporal, temporally located clump of matter to realize an actual concrete particular being. We'll come back to this idea of form and matter in the next video, but the idea is there is this kind of common nature or form, say in our instance, human soul. What differentiates my form, human soul, from yours? Mine informs this particular lump of matter I call my body, and your form informs that particular lump of matter called your body. If there's this common form called table, what differentiates one from another? This particular lump of matter in this room versus that particular lump of matter in that room. So form and matter. Thus, for example, I consist of two real and really distinct aspects. humanness, form, and the particular matter of my body, which owns a set of properties common to all other humans. I'm thus one distinct individual which owns the same set of properties as many other individual beings, namely the set of shared properties that makes me one individual of the same kind or essence or nature, human. Right? Whatever that form is, it's that thing that makes us, you listening to this, it makes us the same, human. Whatever that form is, it's that essential set of properties that makes us human. And those properties are realities, each of which exists in many individuals and thus in many places. But it's a real something. Well, hopefully that wasn't too terribly confusing. A few more questions about being before we wrap up this video. What is change and how is it possible? Well, we talked about that with the ship of Theseus. I won't get into it more. We're going to talk about Aristotle's concept of potency and act in the next video. Otherwise, we're not going to treat this one because, as you can imagine, it's a pretty... whoops. Where's my video? There it is. What is change and how is it possible? We're going to have to pass on that. But just know that this is a major question in philosophy. What does it mean for something to change but still be itself? And to what degree does a thing change and become something else? It's that question of unity again. Why is there something rather than nothing? That's probably the biggest and most important question in metaphysics. Why is there anything? That's a question we'll examine in part 5 when we talk about God. And then finally, here's metaphysics at its heart too. What then is there? Like, how do we explain being? And that's where in our next video we're going to look at a series of metaphysical systems that try to answer this question, what then is there?